we're going to be playing Jackbox games as well as other Zoom-friendly games. So please come around, or please stick around afterward and come play games with us, and we'll have fun. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Just a couple of announcements that I have. You probably know that there's just a few weeks left. I'm sure you're kind of looking for announcements of defenses to attend so you can fulfill that seminar assignment to attend a defense. There is one scheduled for Monday afternoon. I'm aware of 2 or 3 others kind of behind the scenes being planned still for between now and the end of the semester. There's probably just a couple more that I'm not aware of, so just watch for those. The secretaries are sending out emails about those as they are scheduled, and if you have just incredible difficulty getting something scheduled, just reach out to me and we'll figure something out. We want to make you successful as successful as we can with that assignment. The other announcement I have, and I'll send an email about this as well, is we're going to try an experiment with the last few weeks of seminar this semester. We're going to do a mini class. So we have a former student of our program, Melissa War is her name, is going to do a little mini seminar, mini class on creativity. And so that means that we'll have her, the last 3 seminars will be devoted to her and her work, and she will be giving you some small assignments to complete in between each sessions. And she has a reading that she'd like you to complete before the next seminar next week. So I'll send that out. These are small assignments, very small. We know that this is a half-credit class, so we don't want to be a terrible burden on you, but we also want to help you get some experience with some creativity skills that Melissa's been working on with teachers. And I think you'll enjoy it. I think you'll have a good time. So again, look for that email to come out today or tomorrow. I'll send that. I think we're ready to turn the rest of the seminar over to Dr. Royce Kimmons from our department. We're so grateful for his willingness to present to us today. Please join me in welcoming Royce, and Royce, I'll just turn the rest of the seminar over to you.
Thanks, Jason. I'm excited to be here. How's my audio? Is that okay? Great. So I'm actually going to deviate a little bit from the title that I shared with you earlier, but it's still going to be as grandiose as maybe what I was promising before. But whether or not we can deliver on that is a different question. But so what I want us to talk about a little bit today is the idea of impact and how that relates to the work that we do in scholarship. And I'm thinking about scholarship very broadly here. So I'm not just talking to the folks on the research tracks or the PhD students, because design work is a form of scholarship. Doing a case study is a form of scholarship in the way that I'm conceptualizing it here. And so your design projects that you do for your master's theses would be scholarship as well. But helping us to think a little bit through the impacts that we want to have on the world. So in my previous title, I had continuous improvement in the title. I'm not going to talk about continuous improvement, so I apologize if someone was excited here about that. We can talk about that at another time if you like. But to start, I asked all the faculty if they'd be willing to take 1 or 2 minutes to answer this question from their own perspective. And so what I'm going to have them do is I'm just going to call on each of the faculty that said they'd be willing to do that, and just give them 1 to 2 minutes to answer this question. In your estimation, what person in your field has had the most profound impact and why? And as they're talking, I want to have all the students or anyone else who wants to do this in the chat box to just note what you're hearing. What are you hearing in terms of how is impact perceived? How does one have an impact? Does that make sense? Dr. West, you're the first on my list. Would you be willing to go first?
Yes, that would be fine. Yeah. Let me pull up a picture that I had, and then I'll share my screen real quick. Sorry, let me get organized here. All right. Oh, can you enable screen sharing for me?
Yes.
You should be able to do it now that he's done.
I think Jason has.
Okay. Let me. All right. So the person I'd like to talk to, maybe this is a little bit self-serving, but you'll forgive me hopefully, but my PhD chair passed away about 2 weeks, yeah, 2 or 3 weeks ago, Michael Hanafin. So he's been on my mind a lot, obviously had a big influence on me. And as I was at AECT this last week, I was thinking about him because he was such a strong personality within AECT and that community as well. But maybe to Royce's point, I mean, Dr. Hanafin, they did a study when a few years back, like the most people published in ETR&D, which is kind of the top journal maybe in the field. And I think Dr. Hanafin was number 2. And number 1 was Howard Sullivan, who was Dr. Hanafin's advisor. So it was kind of an interesting moment to realize how much influence Dr. Hanafin was having as a scholar with so many articles published in the journal, but how much influence his advisor, Howard Sullivan, was having because he chaired Dr. Hanafin, taught Dr. Hanafin as a PhD student. And so with that kind of context, that Dr. Hanafin was a really great scholar who published a lot of articles and was cited tens of thousands of times. So in his own right, making impact that way. But if you read an article that an interview that people had with him recently, and I can drop this in the chat window when I'm done, but Oswald did an interview with Michael Hanafin and asked him and said, what is the thing you are most proud of, the biggest contribution you have made? And he said, it was the students that I advised. And we made this little chart for him when he retired. And these are all his different PhD, these are only the PhD students that he advised. And I want to just highlight some of the impact that Dr. Hanafin had by impacting others, so personal impact. So, Peter Rich, you'll recognize, and me, we're both professors at BYU for whatever good that is for the department. Simon Hooper is at Penn State University, is a highly influential scholar over there. Aaron Doring is a faculty. Brad Hokanson, many people know, is a former president of AECT and is an academic grandson of Hanafin. Susan Land at Penn State University. Ixin Choi, who's a professor at the University of Georgia, is her advisee. Jun Ge, right here in the middle, is president of AECT right now. Victor Law is her advisee, and he's professor at University of New Mexico. Priya Sharman's at Penn State. Jeanette Hill is department chair, or was at University of Georgia. Lloyd Reber is now the current department chair at the University of Georgia. Kyle Peck was dean at Penn State. Craig Shepard has leadership roles at the University of Memphis. Ray Pastor is a professor. Unbe is a professor. Minchi was a professor at Purdue. Drew Pauly's prolific professor at UNCC. My point being that perhaps Dr. Hanafin's greatest impact are the people he taught and the impact that those people are having on the field, which makes Dr. Hanafin one of the most impactful people, I think, in the field because of the people he taught. So there you go. You can have impact sometimes by impacting others.
Great, thank you, Dr. West. Dr. McDonald, would you go next?
Yeah, so the person I chose is actually a graduate of our program here at BYU. His name is Brent Wilson. We actually gave him the Honored Alumni Award from the from the McKay School 2 or 3 years back. So Brent graduated in the early mid-'80s, and within half a decade after that, some of his work on what's known as the constructivism movement broke, in a lot of ways, it kind of broke open our field and gave the entire field a new approach and a new paradigm, and allowed a lot of scholars to feel free to pursue other interests other than just traditional behaviorist or very cognitivist approaches to teaching and learning. Some of his books have literally been cited, and publications have been cited just thousands and thousands of times over the years. He's also just a wonderfully warm mentor, to Rick's point, just completely bends over backwards to help the students that he works with feel that they matter and that their work is significant. He was just on my dissertation committee. He was just a committee member and could not have been more generous with his time, helping, mentoring me and coaching me, and just honestly just making me feel good about my work. I actually reached out to him last week to see how he was doing, and he's retired now. So he's again at the end of his career and moving forward with other things, but I think it's just had a tremendous impact on both scholars, practitioners, and students in the field.
Great, thank you. Dr. Leary, would you go next?
Sure. So I had a really hard time pinpointing this down to one person. I've had so many people who have been impactful in my life and in my career. But as I got thinking about it, I figured out that there was one person that kind of got it all started, that cascaded to me meeting others and working with others and doing the various things that I have done so far. So that one person is Dave Wiley. And a lot of you know him because he was a faculty member at BYU, and he still does adjunct work for us and teaches some classes. And if you ever get a chance to take one of his classes, you should. But I met him when I was a master's student at Utah State. He was a faculty member there. And I had a class from him, and he visited some of my other classes as a guest speaker. And I loved the things that he was talking about, the questions he was asking, and the ideas he had. And so that really led me to more ideas in open education and thinking about that, because the job I was in at the time, we were working with open scholarship and things like that. So that really resonated with me. And as I talked with him more and more, it wasn't just the specific research he was doing that really captured me, but it was the questions that he asked me, the things that he asked that challenged my thinking, that made me need to go to the literature to read more, that made me think, well, what is it that I really want? What do I want to do? How do I want to go about doing that? What interests me? What should I do more of? And as I worked with him on different projects, he showed a lot of trust for me to be able to, hey, you take this project and run with it. He persuaded me to, be critical in my own thinking, and he provided a lot of constructive criticism, which was really helpful because it helped me grow a lot more. But that initial time and work with him led me to applying to the PhD program, which led me to my chair, which led me to working with other faculty in the department, which led me to my interest in problem-based learning and meta-analysis and professional development. And that led me to my postdoc, where I met more people and worked with more people who were very influential in the things that I do. So, but Dave is the one who kind of started that and cascaded me to many more people.
Great, thank you, Dr. Leary. Dr. Larson, could you go next?
I would be happy to. Let me share my screen, if they allow me. It says, oh, it says I cannot, okay. You'll just have to imagine. I'm
So if Royce, if you stop your screen share, Ross can start his.
All right,
Okay, go for it.
Okay. All right. Ronald Fisher, 1913, as many see him as the founder of statistics. Now, this picture, he looks all nicely dressed and well put together. Apparently, he was not like this at all in real life. He coined the phrase of absent-minded professor, just never dressed really well, but he was brilliant. He was able to put into practice theoretical mathematical things that had never been put into practice before in applicable ways. Has anyone ever heard of the F-test or ANOVA? All those come from him. All the ways we think about modern statistics came from his paradigm. And what really impresses me about him is the way he came up with these methods. He came up with the ANOVA test because he was asked to analyze reams and reams of data on agriculture. And he had to find a way to analyze that data. And this is early turn of the century. There were no computers, there was no Excel, there was nothing. So he found a way, the ANOVA test, that you could do by hand. And this methodology is so revolutionary that it was used as one of the big statistical methodologies for the next 70 years. It's through his work that millions of people were saved from starvation. A lot of his works with statistics focused on getting crops and getting better crops that would survive in more diverse conditions. He was not a perfect guy, but he definitely has had an impact. And I really admire him for being able to using his theoretical knowledge in a practical way.
Great, thank you. Dr. Rich, would you go next?
Yeah, so this was like Dr. Leary had said, this was hard initially when Royce said, I started thinking about a lot of different people. I figured Dr. West was probably going to talk about Dr. Hannafin. So that kind of gives me a 2-for-1 there. I don't have to mention him again. Obviously, as a mentor, he had a strong impact on the direction that I took. And contrary to almost everyone on here, except for what Dr. Larson just presented as well, I think when I'm thinking about impact and the impact that it's had on the field, impact it's had on my own thinking as well, I look at John Seely Brown. A lot of you have probably read or in Foundations or maybe in another class, or you've heard of an article he wrote called Situated Cognition in 1989 about, it's been 7, maybe 8 years now. We actually invited him out here as an invited scholar. Once a year, we'll usually invite a scholar to come out and talk to us about different ideas. And I mean, this is into the 20 teens, and here's a man who was relevant in the 1980s, and not just relevant for scholars. And if you look up his Situated Cognition article, I think it's been cited over 22,000 times, both for and against. A lot of people were against it as well, against his theories. But I thought the reason that his theories are so influential is he does a really good job of bringing together ideas that other people have had and articulating how they matter for the future as well. So he wasn't the first person to come up with this idea of maybe a social constructivist approach to learning, and neither does he take credit for that solely in his own. If you look at his readings, he credits activity theorists, Russian activity theorists, which is the group that came from Lev Vygotsky and kind of his think tank. But even, in the 20 teens, he came and he was still a forward thinker, right? And he didn't just influence academics. For 20 years, he was the head scientist at Xerox PARC. And he influenced the way that, and maybe you don't think of Xerox PARC, that's copy machines, right? As innovators. But if you go back and you look at kind of the history of innovation, a lot of innovation was coming out of Xerox PARC. And so he's one of those people who his ideas have a way of sticking and have a way of inspiring, both for and against, as I've mentioned, and in terms of influence. So I think that's a person that I look to as somebody who articulates his ideas really well. When we got to meet him in person and he visited us, he was really down to earth, easy to talk to. And as we walked around, people in all sorts of different fields, not just education, actually came to the talk and to his sessions that we had with him. And they were influenced by his thinking as well. So I think he was a really broad thinker that has a way of bringing together ideas from the past and articulating how they can help us think about the future in a lot of different ways.
Great, thank you. Dr. Davies, would you go next?
Okay, sure. I'm going to share a screen too. I am going to talk about Michael Patton. So in evaluation, Michael Patton was probably, he's so well known in the profession that whenever he's at AEA, if he's attending or speaking or on any one of the panels, you're going to easily draw large crowds to that one because he is so influential. And what makes him influential is his willingness to share his ideas about how to do things. And it's not just sharing silly ideas. He's really thought through a lot of the things that he's doing. He's also the director of the Evaluators Institute, which is put on every summer for evaluators to come in and to learn from others. And so he brings together brilliant people, good minds that are going to train and teach and share other ideas. When we look at how prolific he is too, when you look at the books that he's written. He started off probably with his utilization focused evaluation, which is in its 4th edition now, but it's basically use. Why are we doing evaluation? How are we using it? And he's promoting use for that. And then he went into his practical evaluation ideas, but he also did his qualitative research and evaluation methods. So he's kind of been instigating the promotion of qualitative rather than the quantitative, because a lot of the quantitative methods, research methods, was the beginning of evaluation, but then it expanded beyond that, largely because some of Michael Quinn Patton's ideas. And then most recently, he's looking at developmental evaluation. And this developmental evaluation is similar to design-based research when we're talking about instructional design, and how we can't always, just choose a design and do that. We have to be eclectic. We have to be flexible. We have to use, if you're talking about, like, even though he wrote qualitative research, he's really mixed methods. And so he really says, what do we need to accomplish the goal that we have in this research or in this evaluation work? But in terms of probably impacting the field recently, I would say Patton is your man there.
Great, thank you. Dr. Yanshar, would you go next?
Sure. Okay, well, my colleagues have identified some very good examples of impact on the field and on their own professional trajectories. The person I would like to mention briefly is a philosopher, not in education, but somebody who's quite famous in sort of, you might say, the Anglo-American tradition for bringing whole perspectives and paradigms and schools of thought to the awareness of generations of scholars, at least on this side of the Atlantic and in Europe also in some ways. And the person I'm talking about is Hubert Dreyfus. And he's well known for a number of different things. He was one of the first people in the US who helped clarify and popularize the writings of people like Martin Heidegger and Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Soren Kierkegaard, and others along the lines of phenomenology and hermeneutics. He was very famous for doing that and kind of cracked the code on some of their thinking in a way that made it possible for other people to understand them. And most of or a good deal of the major thinkers in that area now are either his students or students of his students, or alternatively people who really reacted against him. So he was in the middle of everything that was going on. But he brought a whole new way of thinking about philosophy really into this tradition. And you could go to no philosophy department around probably in the world really, and mention the name Hubert Dreyfus, everybody would know who that guy was. So a couple of other quick things. One is that he had a very interesting relationship with the artificial intelligence community. And when he was at MIT, he got his PhD from Harvard and then went to MIT as a professor, but there aren't too many humanities people at MIT. They're mostly doing other kinds of things. And he started writing, he looked at what the artificial intelligence people were doing there in their lab and all the related research programs, and started saying, well, this is not going to work. And they laughed at him. And he started writing papers about this, telling them why it wasn't going to work. And eventually, to make a long story short, he was right. And many of these laboratories ended up losing their funding because they listened to Dreyfus's arguments and realized these programs aren't going where we thought they were going to go. We're not going to even put money in these anymore. And so what happened was the whole way of thinking about artificial intelligence shifted into different ways that are much better. And there's wonderful things are happening there, and then sometimes some things that are like not so great, but in terms of progress. But he not only was he making great headway in philosophy, but he was going outside of philosophy into places like artificial intelligence and having serious impact. And then he did stuff on learning and skill acquisition, and had big impact there. And we don't hear about it so much in our department unless I'm talking about it. But you can find lots and lots and lots of articles and books that he has written, and a typical article is referenced like 2,000 times, 7,000 times, that sort of thing. But his biggest book was called What Computers Can't Do, which had major impact on how people thought about these things. So I think what's wonderful about him is the way he brought so many new ideas to so many people, and then his students like Dr. Hannafin, but in a different way. had such a major impact, not only on his students, but on how those students influenced the whole field in kind of coming in waves. And then he had a major impact on me, though I never knew him, though some of my colleagues in APA knew him. But I really didn't find my real identity as a scholar until I started reading his stuff more carefully and saw how what he was doing provided some leads for me. And then that just, for me, just opened it all up and made it very easy after that. So.
Great, thank you so much. Dr. Graham, I know that you said you were having trouble with this question. Would you mind just taking 60 seconds or so to explain to us maybe why? I mean, you're welcome to answer the question, but if you don't answer if you don't feel like you can answer the question, just tell us kind of why you're struggling with that.
Well, part of what I was struggling with it is I was trying to decide, well, what field are we talking about having an influence on? Because there's so many different dimensions. If you look at our, had 7 or 8 faculty speak already, and they all have chosen different people that have made impacts in very different kind of dimensions of our field. So I kind of, in reflecting on this question, one of the things that I thought about, I chose someone who has had a profound impact in the area of blended learning and online learning. And this person is Randy Garrison. Randy Garrison was at University of Calgary, and he had some very influential ideas at the time of when the internet had just started to emerge as a tool for learning. And he helped the field transition from thinking about online experiences being more transactional to online experiences being more community oriented and community based. And he developed a theory that's widely used called the community of inquiry. And so as I was thinking about this, I was also thinking, as I was listening to the other people share their ideas, that almost all of, if not all of the people that were mentioned are people who have made significant contributions to the theories and the models that we use to think about the ideas in our field. And it sometimes in our field, we're a practical field, and sometimes we think about, we have kind of, I know that we had some students that have had pejorative thinking around theories, and that theories are all just this pie in the sky kind of thing. But I think if you look at these people who we've talked about, who've had a big influence, their ideas and their theories or their models, their frameworks have helped us to think deeper and practice better. And so I think that that's an important thing that's happening. And the ones that were even more powerful or more influential not only developed important theoretical contributions within the field, but they were also great mentors. So they got along, like Hannafin or like, any of these other Patton, they got along well with people. They knew how to share their ideas and build other people up. So it wasn't just all about them, but it was about others also being able to build and contribute to this body of knowledge. So.
Great, thank you so much. I think that was everybody. If not, feel free to flag me down. So as you reflect on this, what you've heard, I think a couple of things that at least I want to mention is that I heard a lot of diversity in terms of kind of different fields, different types of impact, and how people were interpreting impact. And even as Dr. Graham said, like, what field are we talking about? And this is not a criticism, but this is just an acknowledgement of what I noticed as well, was that everyone that was mentioned tended to be North American. Everyone that was mentioned tended to be a white male. And I just point that out just to show that, or to suggest that maybe there is room for growth in our field and in these variety of fields that we're connected with, so that more perspectives are represented and that there's area for growth. And I bring that up just to point out that you are needed, your perspectives are needed, and that anyone can and should be having an impact on our field. Jacob asks, what about me? I was just gonna avoid the question altogether because I didn't wanna have to, I like holding my colleagues' feet to the fire, not my own. Yeah, I'll just like shortly answer from a professional perspective. I mean, my mentor and advisor, George Villachanos, has had a great impact on me, as has Dr. Wiley, but Dr. Leary already mentioned him. I think at a deeper kind of philosophical level, I point to writers such as Kierkegaard as being influential in how I think and how I approach problems in the world. So in taking a step back and trying to untangle this idea of impact, I think one of the benefits that we have being at this university and approaching these problems is we can ask bigger questions of what does impact mean, like at an eternal level, at a personal level. And as I think about our Father in heaven, how does he interpret impact? The verse that comes to mind is from Moses, chapter 1, verse 39, where God says, "This is my work and my glory to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man." And that is I see that as God's mission statement, the impact that he wants to have on the universe. And I see that manifested in BYU's mission statement, which I think is the most lofty mission statement of any organization I've ever heard of in the history of the world. And that BYU's mission statement is to assist individuals in their quest for perfection and eternal life. And I love that mission statement. But as you can anticipate, one of the difficulties with this mission statement is it's difficult to observe, it's difficult to measure. How do you know if you've actually helped someone to in their quest for perfection and eternal life? And so as we heard different people talk, different faculty members talk, you heard some things that they say that might be measurable, like number of citations, and they were interpreting that as impact, but you also heard some more relational things being mentioned, like impacts that individuals have had on them as people. So I want us to take just a couple minutes. I'm gonna give us 2 minutes of silence, and I want you to just in the chat box to reflect on what is your mission in life, which is kind of how sometimes we talk about it from a gospel perspective, but like to kind of connect it to what we've been talking about. What impact do you want to have on the world? And this can be through your profession or through your personal life. But let's just take 2 minutes of silence for you to reflect and just to try to come up with what your mission statement is. What is your statement of impact that you want to have on the world? And let's share those in the chat box. And the timer starts now. take about 10 more seconds to finish your thought if you haven't, and feel free to read what other people are saying and respond to them if you like. Okay, now I want you to answer another question. Is how will you know when you have succeeded? So let's take 1 minute for this one. I know some of you kind of hinted at this already, but how will you know if and when you're successful? Okay, great. I'm seeing some great things in the chat box. I think just to kind of bring together some of what I'm seeing, it seems like some of these things can be observed or measured. Other things can't. Other things are kind of more intuitively known. And some things are kind of maybe not even intuitively known. Maybe you don't even know if you're going to be successful. Each of those has its own kind of potentials and challenges associated with it. So if something's easily measurable and observable, then sometimes we start to wonder, well, does it really matter? Versus if I can't observe it, if I can't ever know if I'm successful, then that creates this perpetual state of not knowing if I'm achieving my mission in life. And so it seems like there are challenges with kind of both ends of that spectrum. But let's kind of think through this a little bit more. And I'm gonna kind of pivot a little bit to focus a bit more just on scholarship. I like the depth that we've been going at in the chat box, but I'm gonna like focus in on the issue of scholarship in particular and think about and explore how we kind of determine impact in that regard. And then hopefully that'll help us to think through this in a broader way as well. The history of scholarship is really interesting for a lot of reasons. And I've written an article or two that talk about this, at least a little bit. If you look at the history of scholarship, I think one of the things that you see is a shift in what it means to be a scholar. So going back to medieval times, or as books had very limited availability, people who were able to be scholars tended to be the ultra wealthy or those who were cloistered in a monastery. So the only people who could afford books would be princes or universities. In fact, the only way that you would have a university is if you were wealthy enough to have a library. And so at that time, so this is a picture here in the top left of Sir Francis Bacon. At that time, in order to be a scholar, you had to either yourself be super wealthy and powerful or be affiliated with an institution that was and devote your life to that institution, essentially. And so this was, like Thomas Aquinas would fall under this category, maybe even Newton. These were scholars whose life it was to be scholars, but they were able to do it because of the position that they were in, and they were a very, very small elite group. But one of the things that happened was that shortly thereafter, Gutenberg invented the press, which allowed books to be published at a much lower cost. And this democratized knowledge access in many ways. It made possible many of the kind of innovations and social movements that we kind of take for granted now. I don't think that our own church would have been founded if it hadn't been for the printing press. How essential is that for the publishing and dissemination of the Book of Mormon? But one of the things that happened by drastically reducing the cost of access to printed materials, it allowed anyone that was reasonably well off to gain access to pretty much all of the world's knowledge. You had a limited number of volumes that you needed to access to really be able to say that I am a learned person. And so then this gave rise to what was called the amateur scholar, people like Ben Franklin, who was able to, in his own home, just have access to the wealth of the world's knowledge, and was able to innovate and try new things and bring a lot of different fields of study together, which is really exciting in many ways. And that's why Ben Franklin was able to invent many things and write about a variety of topics. As time progressed, though, what we saw as more and more knowledge was being created was that in order to have an impact on the world, one had to become increasingly specialized. And so I have a picture here of Marie Curie. So this led to maybe our current understanding of the scientist as a specialist, someone who has to not just understand philosophy and nature and these kinds of things in order to write Origin of Species, for instance, as Darwin did, but one had to spend their life in a lab focusing on a particular element or a particular problem and able to solve that problem. And so all of a sudden, now we've moved away from this idea of a scholar being someone who kind of knows at a surface level, at least, all of the world's knowledge, to someone who's very specialized in what they are able to do. As that kind of continued to progress, one of the things that we see and still bears out today in scholarship is that the amount of information and knowledge available in the world is far too much for anyone to grapple with. And so what happened is that scholars started to become managers. And you see this like in doctoral programs. It's different in different fields, like in a physics department, for instance. It's very rare to have a physics paper published with fewer than 10 authors. Often they have maybe 200 authors on them. And there are lots of reasons for that. But one of the reasons is that it's difficult to address very, very increasingly specialized problems at the limits of human knowledge if you don't have a team of people that are helping you to deal with that altogether. And Thomas Edison is a great example of this. He's credited with lots of inventions, maybe the most well-known of which is the incandescent light bulb. But like technically, Edison didn't invent the light bulb himself. It's not like he was in a lab. He was managing hundreds of people that were trying to create light bulbs. So like Edison himself, I think you could argue, wasn't so much a scientist as he was a manager. Sure, he had a scientific bent to what he was doing, at a scientific goal, but the actual scientists were the people who were working for him. But he was able to achieve his goal by being able to manage people. Again, fast forward a little bit more to today, and one of the things that information technologies has done is it's now placed the scholar in the role of a public intellectual. And so some examples of this in this slide are like Jordan Peterson, Dan Willingham in our own field, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Brene Brown. And because what has happened is now, as someone becomes so specialized in a field and we feel like they have knowledge that we care about as a society, through the internet, through mass media, we now think that it's valuable for them to be able to have a platform for sharing that. Which has some benefits and drawbacks associated with it. Like Jordan Peterson, for instance, became famous not because of his work in cognitive psychology, which is what his training is in and what he is a specialist in, but because he took a political stance in Canada. And I guess I'm just addressing this because one of the things that we see is there's a relationship between how knowledge is disseminated, how information is disseminated, and how we define a scholar and how we think about scholars. In our current world of social media, I think it's also important to recognize that this has given rise to an idea of a pseudo scholar or a celebrity as scholar. And I put a question mark there because even saying that or labeling in that way, I think could be pushed back on as being elitist, which it probably is, but that might be a form of elitism that I'm okay with. Because like you look at someone like Bill Nye the science guy. Bill Nye is a very interesting character because he has a degree in mechanical engineering, but he doesn't ever speak about mechanical engineering. And his history and his career was that he was a comedian. He graduated in mechanical engineering, then he became a comedian, and things weren't going very well. He tried a few different characters, but then he found that if he tried to connect science in some way to what he was doing, people liked it. And so he branded himself as Bill Nye the Science Guy, which is fascinating because now he is treated as a public intellectual and a public scholar. He is invited to debates on global warming. He's not a climatologist, and yet we view him as someone who has legitimacy because he is a comedian who has framed himself as a scholar that cares about science. Maybe an extreme example of this would be like YouTube influencers like PewDiePie here, which is the second image, who take stances on a variety of political issues and talks about all kinds of things that related to psychology or history or social movements, but really has no training at all, but people listen to him. Sal Khan is another example. Sal Khan was a hedge fund manager who started creating videos for his I think it was his nephews, explaining some basic math concepts to them, and that grew into Khan Academy, to the point now that he is influential in informing how, like, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and how states approach educational problems. Again, no training in education or instructional design or anything like that, but he is influential in guiding decision makers in how to approach these kinds of problems. And I just threw Dave Chappelle on here. Dave Chappelle is a comedian. His mother was a professor of African American studies, so he grew up really enmeshed in discussing issues of race, and also through his own experiencing issues of race and racism, and that comes out in his work as a comedian. But even in his this last week, he hosted Saturday Night Live, and one of the comments that he made was that people don't care about what I have to say unless there's a punchline at the end, which he was saying because he was feeling like he has some really valuable things to say, but no one cares unless he kind of dresses it up as a joke. But and I understand that perspective, but on the other hand, Dave Chappelle doesn't have any training as a scholar, and so he's not a specialist. And so why would we care about what he has to say on these issues? And all that is to say, there are many people who think that they have something to contribute to the world. But because of the way that we have the technology has advanced and how mass media has advanced, there is not parity typically between who we are listening to and the credentials that they have or the legitimacy of what they're trying to say, if that makes sense. And so I'm not critiquing Dave Chappelle or anything that he says, but I am saying that we've come to assume that because people are listening to us, that brings with it some kind of level of legitimacy to what we have to say. And we've conflated those two things together as a society. And that seems problematic when we try to think about issues of scholarship and impact. So in traditional scholarship, we think about, and I'm almost out of time, so I have to fly through this really quickly, but things like impact factors as being central to this, but I think folks are rethinking this. Maybe just a couple things to fly through to give you a sense for this. So these are examples of 2 articles that I've written that have been accessed maybe a couple 100 times. You notice on some of these, one was cited once, one was cited not at all. But like, these are 2 of the articles that I feel are the most impactful, or the most important, and I think are 2 of the most important things that I've written. But that doesn't bear out in kind of the impact that it's having on the world. Versus here is, if you look here, the one on the left is a book chapter that I wrote that is published in a traditional publishing venue. It's been downloaded about 1,000 times since 2017. Pretty much the same content I wrote up in an open textbook chapter that is available on EdTech Books. And on that, we don't just look at downloads, but we can look at how long people are on the page and predict whether or not they actually read it. And we found that people have read it almost 9,000 times since 2018. And then on the right side over here, I have a YouTube video that pretty much, again, has the same content. That's been viewed almost 70,000 times since 2016. And I know that that's a large underestimation of its impact, because I have a lot of schools reaching out to me telling me that they show this video to auditoriums full of teachers to teach them about copyright. So just one view might actually be hundreds of people viewing it. So when I see this, the purpose for showing you this is not to like discredit these kinds of articles or to discredit the traditional publishing venues that we go through as academics, but to question are there other ways of thinking about impact that we should be thinking about as well? One of my big projects that many of you know about and many of you have collaborated with me on is EdTech Books, which is an open textbook platform. Now we're getting about 30,000 unique readers per month on that platform across all the various books, and that's in large part due to the quality of content. Well, it's driven by the quality of content that we have, created by people like Dr. Graham, Dr. West, Dr. McDonald, and all the people that contribute. And it's been up for almost 2 years now. And just at AECT this last week, the editor for one of the top EdTech journals, Journal of Research on Technology and Education, Albert Ritzoff, said this about the platform. He said, this platform has had a profound influence on our field. And it's only been active for 2 years. And so I think about that, and I think about like the work that I do and what I'm doing that actually has an impact and has value, or why it has value. These kinds of things give me pause, because it doesn't necessarily relate to maybe some of the things that we traditionally think of having impact in scholarship. Maybe just one last thing, and then I'll close because I'm way over time. Well, yeah, I have a lot more to say, but maybe just I'll skim through this really quickly. A couple of takeaways that I just want to mention are: any system or metric can be gamed. So if our focus is on just an impact factor, or just the number of downloads, or just the number of page views, we need to be thoughtful about that, because at the end of the day, we need to make sure that we're performing well on things that matter most to you. And those are some of the things that you all mentioned in the sidebar over there, or in the chat box: the number of people you're impacting through your work, the number of relationships you're developing. In terms of your own work moving forward, I think you should be strategic, but keep a proper perspective, specifically as you're doing your master's thesis or your doctoral work. Your thesis or dissertation is not your contribution to the world. It's a gate that you pass through so you can make your contribution to the world. You also don't have to change the world, but you should change your corner of it. There's this great quote from Gandalf in Lord of the Rings that it's not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule. Fourth takeaway is there are no silver bullets in educational research or educational improvement, and there are no unicorns. So if people say that they have the solution, that if we just got everybody doing game-based learning, all of our problems would be solved, they're wrong, and they don't know what they're talking about. And so actual improvement in education comes step-by-step, iteration upon iteration, and by small and simple increments of lots of people putting forth concerted effort towards solving problems. And last, on that same note, is that incrementalism or innovation is almost always preferable to revolution. And so in thinking through a lot of people who want to try to have an impact on the field, you have a lot of folks who take a revolutionary stance on this and say, oh, we have to throw everything out, we have to start from scratch. But typically what that means is that they don't really understand history, they don't understand what has come before. And I think hearing from the faculty today can help you hopefully gain some appreciation for the work and the people who have gone before you, and build upon what they have done, and not assume that we need to start from scratch at any point in time. So I'm way over. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Dr. McDonald, and I'll stop there.
Well, we certainly want to thank Royce for this very thought-provoking, wonderful presentation. Let's thank him for spending some time with us today. We all know how to find him if we want to ask follow-up questions, I think, or I assume we all know how to find him. Royce, thank you again. That concludes our seminar for this week. Remember, I'll be sending out a reading assignment for seminar next week, and then it will build between now and the end of the semester. So enjoy the rest of your day, enjoy the rest of your week, and we will see you again in seminar next week. And Maku, I will turn the